Aaron. Give us an update on the aftermath of the meltdown in the Oval Office, where Zelensky was basically told to go home, work on an apology, and come back and work out a deal. It was to be a deal for Ukrainian mineral wealth with no security guarantees. Zelensky went to Europe and received promises of new weapons and diplomatic protection and support for escalating the war against Russia, the failing war. And now Marco Rubio, after talks in Riyadh, has announced that the U.S. is resuming support for Ukraine. I mean, where does this leave things?
So, yeah, as you said, after that meltdown at the White House, Zelensky goes home. The Trump administration immediately cuts off weapons and intelligence sharing with Ukraine, intelligence sharing for striking targets inside Russia, not intelligence sharing for defensive purposes, which they still continued, but they did cut off the weapons. That led Zelensky to issue an apology to Trump and to send a delegation of Ukrainian officials, including Andrei Yermak, who's his chief of staff, who is said to be basically running the show, to meet with Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz in Saudi Arabia. And they agreed on this new U.S. proposal for a 30-day ceasefire. And they also said that they would sign the minerals deal that Trump wants. So when Ukraine committed to this 30-day ceasefire, then Rubio and Waltz were saying, okay, now the ball's in Russia's court, and we'll see. And we got the answer today from Vladimir Putin. And basically, Putin made it sound like he was accepting the ceasefire proposal, but he's not. He's basically saying what he said all along, which is that the only way to end this war is for Russian security needs to be taken into account, the same ones that were on the table when this whole thing began. And so let's hear what he says. And let's start this clip at 102.
Of Ukraine.
Yeah.
For the ceasefire, life in the conflict. Secondly, is we agree with the proposals for the ceasefire, but our position is based on the assumption that the ceasefire would lead to a long-term peace, something that would remove the initial reasons for the crisis. As for the readiness of Ukraine to ceasefire, there's a meeting between Americans and Ukrainians in Saudi Arabia, and it looks like a decision that is taken by Ukrainian side under American pressure. In reality, I am completely convinced that Ukraine had to ask Ukrainians, ask Americans, insist on this, based on the situation on the ground.
So what he's saying is, we'd love to have a ceasefire, but only if it actually ends the war. And to end the war, you have to accept Russian security needs, which is making official that Ukraine will not join NATO, recognizing now that Russia has laid claim to these provinces inside Ukraine, where there are a lot of ethnic Russians, and also, not having the Russian language and Russian culture banned in Ukraine anymore. That has to be secured. And there are other issues that he wants addressed as well, including the expansion of NATO and the size of NATO military infrastructure surrounding Russia. And so really, this comes down to, and what he's also saying there is, we don't need a ceasefire. It's Ukraine that does. And that's why, by the way, it's obvious what Ukraine was doing when they launched that drone attack, including at Moscow, right before these talks with the U.S. began. They were trying to put pressure on Putin to make him want to accept this 30-day pause in the fighting. But Putin's not going to be deterred, is the message he's sending there. And ultimately, my take on this is simply, this comes down to Trump. Will Trump actually be willing to to recognize that the U.S. is a belligerent in this proxy war? As Marco Rubio called it last week, he said, we have to be honest, this is a proxy war, which is a good first step to acknowledging that. And if Trump can, acknowledge that the U.S. is a belligerent, is he actually willing to do something to address Russian security concerns, which no one has been willing to do so far? He's been willing to say that Ukraine will not join NATO. He said that publicly, but will he put that in writing? And will he put other commitments in writing. And will he also be willing to cut off Ukraine, cut off the military support and intelligence that Ukraine needs to keep fighting? Because we saw what happened when the intelligence and the military support to the Ukraine was cut off. Russia made new advances in Kursk and has basically stifled the Ukrainian offensive there. So that's the question. It's really, I think it comes down to not what Ukraine will do, but what Trump will do. And that's, he's so unpredictable. That's anyone's guess.
Well, if Trump is rearming Ukraine, and we've seen arms shipments flow through Europe, including supposedly neutral states like Austria, and at the same time, Russia's winning on the battlefield. I mean, look at this. This is what are we looking at? This is an update from the battlefield from AMK mapping, which is basically talking about a complete collapse of the Ukrainian military in Kursk. The situation continues to deteriorate for the Ukrainians, and the lines collapse under Russian pressure. On and on and on. Kursk is critical for the Ukrainians. They've been prepared by the British. This is where some of their best remaining forces are concentrated for this battle. Kursk also is historically the site of the largest tank battle in World War II, which helped break the back of the Nazi panzer divisions by the Soviet Union. And I mean, it just doesn't look good. So Russia's going to have to freeze its forces when it's advancing on the battlefield. This would seem to benefit Ukraine, and the US and Ukraine are now negotiating sort of as one. It seems like kind of a reversal of where it doesn't seem to be leading to a durable ceasefire is what I'm saying.
Well, that's the question. Like, it might appear that the US is now switching to siding with Ukraine again, but we don't know that, like, for sure. It ultimately comes down to how now Trump responds to Putin's call. I mean, what if Trump says, yeah, he's right, there needs to be more commitments from Ukraine to have the ceasefire be durable? We'll see. And also, look, the US is still sending military weaponry, but there's only so much left from the last allocation authorized by Congress. And the question will be, once that runs out, it's at a couple of $2 billion, I think. Once that runs out, is Trump, after saying all this about how we have to end the war, how this war should never have started, after that meltdown with Zelensky, where Zelensky insulted him and acted just ridiculously petulant, is Trump going to go to Congress and say, hey, let's give this guy another $50 billion in weaponry? I would find that hard to believe. But then again, with Trump, you have to leave any possibility open, because you never know. He's pretty unpredictable. But as of now, it's just unclear to me like what the Trump administration really wants to do. And maybe they haven't decided yet. Like, maybe they actually just don't really have much of a plan here, and they're hoping that they can just talk about peace and that will get everyone to the table. But I think what Putin is underlining here with his comments today is that you actually have to address our concerns, and we don't need a ceasefire. That would just give Ukraine time to rearm, and that doesn't serve our purposes when we're winning. And that makes sense because they're the stronger power, which is why fighting this proxy war, on top of being ridiculously immoral and unnecessary, was just so futile to begin with, because Russia was always going to come to this point and win. As Barack Obama used to say when he was in office, and so did Antony Blinken too, long before Joe Biden came to power and changed everything.
So what is the next move? I mean, you've said you don't know what Donald Trump will do next. What's next on the agenda? I mean, there was the meeting in Riyadh. Is there any process or track here for getting to a ceasefire, especially when Europe clearly wants to escalate?
Well, let's hear from Trump. This is what he said today, and he touches on your question a little bit.
Well, would like to see a ceasefire from Russia, and we have, not been working in the dark. We've been discussing with Ukraine land and pieces of land that would be kept and lost, and all of the other elements of a final agreement. There's a power plant involved, a very big power plant involved. Who's going to get the power plant, and who's going to get this and that? And so, it's it's not an easy process. But phase one is the ceasefire. A lot of the individual subjects have been discussed, though. You know, we've been discussing concepts of land because you don't want to waste time with the ceasefire if it's not going to mean anything. So we're saying, look, this is what you can get. This is what you can't get. They discussed NATO and being in NATO, and everybody knows what the answer to that is. They've known that answer for 40 years, in all fairness. So a lot of the details of a final agreement have actually been discussed. Now we're going to see whether or not Russia's there, and if they're not, it'll be a very disappointing moment for the world.
So again, it's hard to parse exactly what he's saying, but you could see some indication that he's taking Russian concerns seriously in the first part of his answer, where he says that there's no point in wasting time with a ceasefire if it's not going to lead to anything. And that would seem to comport with Putin's statement. But then he says, if Russia's not on board, that'll be very disappointing. And but he does say that there's already been progress made on some of these issues, including Ukraine, agreeing that it's not going to get back some of its territory. And Marco Rubio has already talked about that publicly. So maybe behind the scenes, Ukraine is being pushed into that. My guess is that Trump and his team simply haven't decided yet on exactly what they want to do. And now Putin is challenging them today to make a decision. Like, either you recognize either you're willing to recognize our security concerns, or you're not. And if you're not, then we're going to keep fighting.
It's funny because Zelensky is simultaneously accusing Russia of being silent and not taking the initiative to initiate the ceasefire, to not seizing the ceasefire by the horns because Russia is advancing on the battlefield. So he's tacitly admitting that his troops are taking heavy losses, that they're losing Kursk, which is sort of remarkable because it stands at odds with the propaganda. But at the same time, Zelensky is throwing tons of obstacles in the way of negotiations. And here's one of them. After meeting with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, Zelensky wants quote unquote Ukrainian children returned. The two leaders discussed Saudi Arabia's potential role in mediating the release of Ukrainian prisoners of war, as well as the return of Ukrainian children who were illegally deported to Russia, the presidential office said. We've done a ton of reporting on this at the Grayzone. This was the basis of the ICC warrant for Vladimir Putin's arrest, that he had supposedly kidnapped thousands of Ukrainian children. But as we explained, they were supposedly taken to detention camps. As we even showed through Jeremy Lafredo, our reporter visiting one of those supposed camps, which turned out to be a free center, or a center where youth from the Donbass region who are under the gun, who are being shelled by the Ukrainians who speak Russian and identify with Russia, were getting free classical music and opera lessons and enjoyed being there and were there with the consent of their families. The truth wasn't exactly being told about these deported children. The vast majority of them, as even the United States acknowledged in a report that was produced with research by the State Department, had been taken out of the war zone into the Russian Federation with their families' consent because they did not identify with Ukraine and would have considered Ukraine taking their territory in the Donetsk and Lugansk republics as an occupation. Zelensky's now referring to them as Ukrainian children. I don't think they're coming back unless I'm mistaken about the specific children he's referring to. So I'm just, my point is, I don't think this ceasefire will be durable, and we're going to be looking at war into the foreseeable future.
By the way, that allegation, even without looking at all the details, as the Grayzone did, standing apart from literally everyone else who just parroted the dominant narrative, and also putting aside that it was based on a State Department report, which is odd for the ICC to be like basing a warrant on the work product of a government that is fueling a multi-gazillion dollar proxy war with Russia. Putting all that aside, this allegation has never made sense. Why would Russia mass kidnap a bunch of children? Like for what purpose?
To like offset their negative birth rate or something?
Yeah, it never made any sense. And also, and the other glaring thing about that, why didn't that ICC warrant include Bucha, where Russia was accused of, massacres that for some Ukrainians was reason to not have a peace agreement. That was for some people the excuse to walk away from the Istanbul Accords. How come the ICC indictment of Putin didn't include that?
We answered that question through an interview Jeremy Lafredo conducted with Nathaniel Raymond, the State Department funded researcher at Yale University. He asked him, why not do Bucha? Remember, that was the big set piece.
Yeah.
And he said, actually, these New York Times reporters who were in Bucha have been calling me and pressuring me to make that the indictment so that they can get Pulitzer Prizes, which just shows you how corrupt the New York Times is. And he said, we can't do it because we don't have any evidence of any commanders giving orders to massacre anyone. And we want to go for the big dog, Putin. And the only thing we can get Putin on is this order he gave to evacuate these children or youth. And because most Americans and Westerners don't understand the distinction between Russian speaking or ethnically Russian Ukrainians and like the Western Ukrainians, they'll just say, well, these are just children who are being taken from Ukraine against their will, like kicking and screaming. And then if you read Nathaniel Raymond's report, it's like the children were taken on nature walks in the Russian Federation, and then they went home on a bus. It's like no one read that report except us. I mean, very few people did. And then the ICC never even released a report. It never produced any evidence. It was just like, here's our indictment. It came out so fast they wouldn't have had time to anyway. And the report, I mean, we're going on and on, but it's kind of fun to revisit this. The report was based on like Maxar satellite data and public social media postings. There was no field research that even took place, which is what you'd usually expect. And what we got from the ICC on Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, there was tons of field research there. So
it's amazing what you can learn when you actually just read the source material, which is supposed to be part of the job description as a journalist. You have the time to do it, that you're paid to do, but a lot of people just decline that part of the job, and it leads to ridiculous, stories like this and warrants that are baseless based on all the.
So Zelensky's now throwing this, gumming up the works on negotiations with this issue. And I'm sure the Europeans are happy about that. But he will continue to lose on the battlefield. And an entire generation of Ukrainians is being wasted for a lost cause. Anyway, we'll continue to follow this because the Trump administration clearly wants to get somewhere. It's just unclear to me where they're trying to get to after the last meeting.
Yeah.
But they're going to keep some kind of pressure on Zelensky.
Yeah. And look, they have competing constituencies. There's Trump himself, who has, I think, good instincts on this. He understands that NATO expansion was a major provocation. He understands that there was a coup in 2014 with Victoria Nuland and the Biden administration and the Obama administration all over that. He understands that. But the problem is he's got a cabinet of people like Marco Rubio who are all on board with this agenda, and they're still represented in Congress, especially in the Senate. Most Republicans in the Senate especially are on board with this proxy war policy. But then he has people around him like J.D. Vance who are not on board with this. And so when you have different factions, you leave space for some confusion. And I don't think Trump has decided yet on which way he wants to go. In his first term, he often decided with the neocons. This term, though, he does have more people around him who have a dissenting point of view on this issue. So I think he's still figuring it out.